Hi, how's everybody doing today? Looks like I've got a technical issue right here at the last second, which is kind of nice. So just noticed it. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna, what am I gonna do? Well, it looks like, hold on, let me see if I can get another camera in here real quick. This is a nice problem to notice just as we get started. View video 3. Let's see, integrated webcam. Okay. Boom. Let's see what we got. How's everybody doing? Is everybody finished up with the exam yet? Let me know how that's going. Who's done the exam? Anybody? Cool. Oh, well, you know what? Guess what? You're just not going to have my beautiful picture today. Is that okay? Can everybody hear me? How's the sound coming through? Am I getting some sound? Maybe I should turn down my level just a little bit. You have? Good deal. Hope you did well. I graded everything that was in my inbox this morning starting at about 5:45 a.m. So everybody's stuff was graded by 7 a.m. If you did your homework, it's graded. If you did your exam, it's also graded as well. Good deal. Fantastic. Oh, and you know what else I've got? Hold on. I wonder if I can change this now. No, I cannot. Okay, I've got you set on the wrong latency too. So your responses are going to come in really in a delayed manner. I apologize for that too. So let's see. I've got check typo on Maslow question. Okay, Ken says that there was a typo on the Maslow question. I will be sure to take care of that as soon as I get out of this class. All right, fantastic. So it's good to see everybody. I noticed we got Ashley here, Travis W. here, Alexander, good to see you, Madison Fitz, Ashley Riddick, KB, it's good to see everybody. Hopefully Renee Young will be here momentarily, and when she is, she'll send me a good morning text like she usually does. Without further ado, let's get started in Chapter 12, Social Psychology. For those of you who are just showing up, I apologize for the black frame in the corner. I didn't get my makeup on today, so I decided to go with the black screen. How does that sound? All right, so we're talking about social psychology today. Social psychology is really interested in how humans function in groups. Humans function in groups. And we're going to talk about sort of the effect that the social environment has on the way we think, feel, and behave. Today we're going to be talking about attributions, which is the explanations that we have for ours and other people's behaviors. And then we're going to talk about how group identity helps us make these attributions about people who are similar to us and people who are different from us. So we're going to be talking about groups and attributions today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I am a social psychologist. That's my area of expertise. If you look on my PhD diploma, it will say Doctor of Social Psychology. So that is an area where you can specialize. And social psychology is a scientific study of how the real or imagined presence of other people affects the way we think, feel, and behave. Now notice I say real or imagined presence because the people don't have to be there. All I have to do is reference groups that are important to you in order to impact people's behaviors. And we're looking at how these group feelings affect the way we feel, the way we think, and the way we behave. Now, we're looking for universal group processes. As you hear me talking about social psychology, you might be thinking, oh, wow, this is sociology. No. Sociology is sort of the study of systems. So how does the prison system, how does the government system, how does capitalism as a system? It's the study of systems. Social psychology is the basic group processes that underlie underlie that system. So how does a group of 3 people function regardless of whether or not they're in a jail, whether or not they're in a government, or whether or not they're in a bureaucratic process? So we're talking about universal group processes. And also, we're not so much interested in cultural psychology. We're not looking at describing differences specifically between cultures. Again, we're trying to find universal processes that you would find working in all cultures. So think of it as the basic mechanics of group functioning. Now, your book is going to talk about 5 broad areas of social psychology. We're going to cover 4 out of these 5 areas this week. So they talk about attributions, which are the reasons that we give for why we and other people engage in behaviors. Why was that waiter rude? Why did my dad tell me that? Why did I feel that way? So we're talking about attributions, which is the reasons we try to use to give meanings to our world. We're going to be talking about group identity. And so what does it mean to be in a group, and how do you as one group member make general judgments about members of other groups? That may sound like prejudice and racism, and in fact we're going to talk about the group processes, the cognitive processes that we think may underlie why people are prejudiced or have poor feelings towards members of other groups. We're going to talk, that'll be today's lecture. Then tomorrow we're going to talk about how our thoughts and feelings and behaviors are changed by other people. We're going to talk about attitudes, which is persuasive messages. We're all bombarded by persuasive messages every day. How exactly do those persuasive messages affect how we feel and think, right? Then we're going to talk about social influence, or obedience or compliance. If you've ever been in a group of people and done something you didn't think you should do in order not to look like a fool in front of a group of people, then you know exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about social influence. And then the one area we're not going to get to this particular semester is close relationships. So there is a branch of social psychology that looks at the group and social processes that underline our desire and ability to find other people attractive, to build relationships and maintain those relationships. Everybody following me so far? So let's talk about attributions, which are the reasons for our behavior and the reasons that we give for our behavior and those of others. An attribution is an attempt to provide a causal explanation for our behavior as well as the behavior of others. So you might ask, why did that happen? If you talk to somebody and they're nice to you, you might ask yourself, why was that person nice to me? If you do well or poorly on a test, you might ask yourself, why did I fail that test? Was that something I could control? Was that something that was consistent, right? And was that something that was pervasive? So we can ask these different questions, and depending upon how we answer these questions, they have different impacts on the way we feel about ourselves and others. Today we're going to be talking about how we explain the behaviors of others, because most of you every day have interactions with people that are less than optimal. And we always ask ourselves, why was that person doing that? And if you make the wrong kinds of attributions, you can begin to build stress, as it were. Remember last week when we talked about stress? So if you think about it, there are 2 ways to explain other people's behaviors. When somebody engages in something, you can say it was something about their situation which affected their behavior, or you could say it's something about their personality or their disposition that affected their behavior. So, why was Muhammad angry? So my friend Muhammad came in and he was really rude and obnoxious to me. A situational attribution might say, you know what, I'll bet Muhammad's car broke down, or his kid's sick, or he just got a repossession notice, and so he's having a bad day. And so Muhammad, I'm going to make a situational attribution about Muhammad's behavior, right? Now, another broad class of attribution might be what we call a personal or a dispositional attribution. This behavior occurred because that's the kind of personality they have. So Tina came in and she was angry. And you know what? I'm just going to come to the conclusion she's just an impatient, angry person. She's a butthole, right? And so that would be a personal or a dispositional attribution. Now, it turns out that human beings sort of engage in these really funky little biases when we view ourselves and other people's behaviors. Now, the one fundamental problem that we all seem to make is that we all seem to engage in what's known as the fundamental attribution error. Most of the time, especially when we're meeting people for the first time, we have a tendency to overestimate the effect that personality has on another person's behavior. Why was that server rude? Well, they're a rude person. Why was that checkout counter boy not nice to me? Well, he's a racist. Why was Tina not nice to me out in public? Well, she's an elitist. And we make these general dispositional attributions about other people when they engage in behavior. Now, if you think about it from a cognitive sense, this makes from a cognitive point, this makes good sense, because if other people are predictable, then it makes it easier for you to engage in logical deductions and decide how to act. So human beings tend to have this tendency to see other people's behavior as being a function of their disposition. Bizarrely enough, though, whenever we're asked about our own behavior, most of us tend to discount our personality when we make judgments about why we engaged in things. Now, on Friday, I'm going to show you my personality scores, and you're going to see that I'm an angry, neurotic person. When I don't get my way, I tend to get a little bit bent out of shape. When things go wrong, I tend to lose my cool a little bit quickly. Now, if you'd ask me why that happens, why I lost my temper in the grocery store, I'll say, you know what, that grocery store clerk was not being nice to me, and my car broke down. If you said, okay, Chris, well, why were you rude in class the other day? Well, it's because I had just spilled coffee in my lap and I was running late from a student meeting. Okay, Chris, well, why were you angry when you were out there playing baseball last Sunday? Well, the umpire was making bad calls. You notice what I'm doing here? I'm giving myself situational attributions. And this difference, this tendency to make these different kinds of attributions is what's known as the actor-observer bias. And this is the tendency to simultaneously attribute my behavior to situational causes while attributing other people's behavior to their personality. Exactly. You're right, KB. We give ourselves a break. And if you think about it, it's not even that we're trying to give ourselves a break, but if my environment is consistent and predictable, and I am allowed flexibility of action, that allows me a maximum sense of power, right? So if I had to make a dispositional attribution about myself, then that wouldn't give me the freedom to change my behavior in given situations. Now, we're actually not going to talk about, well, we'll talk about this on Thursday and Friday, but they talk a lot about the power of having this disposition, this situational attribution for our achievement outcomes. So it turns out that people with high achievement motivation, when they do well, they tend to attribute it to their disposition. Well, I'm just smart. Whenever and it's also consistent, and it's also systemic. But when they fail, they tend to make situational attributions. Well, I just had a bad day. And people who have low achievement motivation, when they fail, they tend to say that it's consistent. They tend to give dispositional attributions. So our attributional style actually depends upon how confident we feel in the particular area that we're being asked to judge ourselves. And then the last thing I want to mention, I remember when Kobe Bryant died last year in a helicopter crash, there were some people that talked about how extravagant it was to be taking a helicopter to fly from one part of LA to another part of LA. And in a sense, they almost suggested that Kobe was sort of asking for it by doing this kind of thing. I don't know about you, but I see people on my social media saying that if protesters who are in the street get run over by cars, they certainly deserve it. A lot of times when you see rape cases in court, the defense attorney is going to spend a lot of time trying to suggest that somehow or another the female invited the sexual assault. And so these are all uses of what we would call the just world hypothesis. Another quick sound check. My sound's not getting too high, is it? Okay. And so these are actually attributional biases that people engage in. And again, you can think about the just world hypothesis as giving us a way to explain why bad things happen to people, which again gives us another more sense of control. So if Kobe Bryant dies in an airplane wreck, if I can somehow blame it on his behavior, then that sort of gives me a little bit of protection and a feeling of control over my own behavior. Instead of admitting that you, as a female, you could potentially be attacked and raped randomly, it makes better sense if you can somehow assume that that person did something to invite that attack. That allows you to maybe, in your mind, create the illusion of self-protection. Is everybody following me? I'm not getting too many chats today because I've got the latency set so high. So I wanted to check and make sure everybody's following me. So, one way in which we make attributions about the world, too, is based on the idea of group identity. So it turns out we organize our world and ourselves by groups. And I don't know if you're familiar with these terms, but social psychologists studies prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination. And we think of these processes not so much as socially created ills, but maybe as representing fundamental cognitive processes that people engage in. Okay? Now, I'm not trying to excuse these behaviors. I'm trying to explain from a psychological point why these behaviors might arise. Do you folks see the subtle distinction that I'm making? I'm not trying to forgive prejudice, which is negative feelings or evaluations about a member of another group. I'm not talking about trying to excuse discrimination, which is the unjustified or inappropriate treatment of people based on their particular group identification. But what I want you to do is to think of these things and stereotypes as just schemas that exist in our mind. All right, so I want to first start with the idea of actually, I'll get to schemas in a little bit. But what I want you to understand is that if you think about it, well, actually, I will talk about schemas. If you think about it, your sense of identity is a schema. All right? If I ask you to start describing yourself, everything you tell me about yourself represents a node in that schema. Just like you have all of the concepts that go with birthday party or fire truck, when I say Madison Pitts, a bunch of ideas pop up in your head, Madison, or Ashley Riddick. When I say that, Ashley, tell me about yourself. A bunch of ideas pop up in your head. That's your self-schema. And that really is the only self you have. If you think about it, yourself, who you are, your sense of identity is nothing but a big schema of ideas that includes your history, your preferences, your inferiorities, your strengths, and every belief you have about yourself. Now, here's the deal. Number one, yourself is categorized into what we would call an individual self and a collective self. So you can think about yourself in terms of all the abilities that you have. So for me, I'm 5'7". I'm good at baseball. I like to read. I have gray hair. I can give you all of these specific individual descriptions of myself. But you know what? I can also tell you about myself as I fit into groups, because that is also a very important part of who I am. So I would tell you that I'm a male, which means I fit into the group and have similar qualities with other males. I'm Caucasian, so I fit into that group and I have similar qualities with other Caucasians. I'm American, which means I fit into that group, and I have similar qualities with those, and I'm also from North Carolina. So if you think about it, I can think about myself in terms of my group memberships or my individual qualities. Now, the neat thing is we shift back and forth between our individual self and our collective self depending upon the situation. If you've ever walked into a room where you are in the minority group, either you're an African American and you walk into a group that is composed of nothing but Caucasians, or if you're a male and you walk into a room that's composed of a group of females, you notice that you suddenly start thinking about your group membership. You're like, uh-oh, I'm in this group full of ladies and I'm the only guy, and you start thinking about what it means to be a guy. And so the weird thing is we can bounce back and forth between our individual identity and our collective identity. And the thing is, sometimes our collective identity is good for us, and sometimes our collective identity makes us feel bad, right? So occasionally your sense of groupness may become accessible to you in a situation where it doesn't it's not a good quality. So a lot of times we talk about we ask the question, why do African American student scores lag behind some other ethnic group scores in academic settings? And the idea is that there may be if you will, group identities, stereotypes that we all have that we buy into that say you're not going to be good in this particular situation. So if you think about it, your sense of self and your sense of stereotypes are nothing but big schemas. Right now, the second thing is social identity theory says people are motivated to feel positive feelings towards themselves. And in situations where the collective self is activated, people will tend to reward the in-group. Just like you try to treat yourself individually better than other people, they say you try to treat your in-group better than other people. Does that make sense? So since I'm a Caucasian, if I'm thinking about Caucasians and I see two people of different races competing at a chess game, I might want the Caucasian person to win because that's a part of my identity, which would make me feel good about myself. Does that make sense? This guy named Henri Tajfel, who escaped from the Nazi death camps in World War II and became a social psychologist, studied this in this thing called the minimal group paradigm. He would bring people into a lab and put them into a room by themselves. And then he would tell them that there were 5 other people in the lab. And then he would split them up into 2 groups, but he wouldn't tell the people why they were in group A or why they were in group B. He never even let them meet any of their group members. So that would just be like me telling you, KB, you're in the green group and you have 3 members, and that's all you know about your sense of groupness. He would then give them this opportunity to allocate points to members of different members within both groups. And what he found was that people tended to reward in-group members even when they had no idea why they were in the group, and even when they hadn't met any group members. And what he suggested was we have this need to take care of the collective aspect of ourself. Does that make sense to everybody? I hope so. Now, here's where I should have talked about this earlier. But a stereotype, a stereotype is a term we use to describe a schema which kind of has if you will, a negative connotation. When we talk stereotype, we're always meaning something that in a sense negative, demeans people. But really, a stereotype can be positive or negative, and you can think of it as a schema. It's just a set of beliefs about a particular concept. Just like I told you, when I think of Texas, it's hard for me to imagine a tree in Texas, even though I know they're there. But the image in my mind simplifies Texas down to a desert, right? Same thing when I'm thinking about New York. I'm up here in upstate New York, and it's incredibly rural. But if you hadn't been to New York, most of you would think of New York only as being skyscrapers in big cities. So a schema is a simplification of a concept, and that's exactly what a stereotype is. And we all have stereotypes about our own groups as well as others. So Caucasians understand and believe the stereotypes about Caucasians, just like they understand and believe to a certain extent the stereotypes about other groups. Asians, they understand stereotypes about themselves as well as others. So just because you are the target of a stereotype, its negative effects doesn't mean you don't own the stereotype as well. So I have certain beliefs about how men are compared to women, and I'm sure all you female students believe or understand the stereotypes that exist about women. And the crazy thing is, these stereotypes, these self-beliefs, when activated, actually affect our particular behavior. So your book's going to talk about how these stereotypes can influence other people's and our behaviors. One of the things that you'll sometimes see is this thing called the self-fulfilling prophecy. This guy named Robert Rosenthal up at Harvard showed this about 50 years ago. And the weird thing is, if a teacher is given a stereotype about you or has a stereotype about you, they are likely to change their behavior in such a way to conform with that stereotype, which then causes you to fulfill that particular stereotype. So in the Robert Rosenthal study, what they did was they told teachers, they picked certain students out in the class and told them that those students in a second grade class, and they told the teachers that these students were getting ready to blossom. And they told these teachers that these other students were actually way behind and were going to have difficulty in school. Now, these kids were randomly picked, and at the end of the school year, they compared the test scores and found that the kids who were given the positive reviews at the beginning of the year wound up performing much better than the students who were not given the positive reviews at the beginning of the year. So in a sense, the teacher's belief caused them to change their behavior, which then elicits the performance from the students. We talk about this an awful lot about explaining some of the differences in math ability scores that used to exist between male and female students. Back in, even in the 70s and 80s, the idea was that girls weren't good at math and boys were good at math. Girls read books and boys did math. And what you'll see is differences in achievement on math scores between males and females. But the thing is, if you think that kid's really good at math, you're going to ask them the harder questions. You're going to grade their homework a little bit more difficultly. You're going to expect more from them. If you have a student that you believe is going to do poorly, you don't want to embarrass them by asking them questions in class. You're not going to set the bar as high for them, and you know what? They're not going to develop as fast. And this self-fulfilling prophecy can play itself out in classrooms and jobs and everywhere else you'll see. People in power's expectations causes our behavior to change. Stereotype threat. it turns out that when you give African American students SAT tests and tell them that these tests are just puzzle solving tests rather than IQ tests, it turns out that the difference between African American students and Caucasian students go away. And the idea here is that there are stereotypes that we've developed in our society, and when put in situations that would confirm these stereotypes, these make particular groups of people nervous, which then impairs their performance. Now, so standardized tests can be a self-fulfilling prophecy for students within. Absolutely. Absolutely. KB, I was told I did good on a standardized test when I was probably in second grade, and I was told that I was good at standardized tests. And I never had a moment of anxiety ever taking a test, SAT, end of grade test, California Achievement Test, because I kept believing that I my press, so to speak. And yes, I think it can work both ways too. You know what? We're getting close to the end of time, but oh my goodness. Right. So it turns out the weird thing is with stereotypes and bias, it turns out that even when you try to control your level of bias, it's hard to, because there's what we might call explicit racism, which is over the top, old school racism. And then there's what we'd call modern racism, where people swear that they are not racist, but when they're asked to make judgments, these unconscious biases bubble up and affect their judgments. And so the research suggests that you can think of this modern day racism, this implicit racism, as being what we would say automatic and controlled processes. So it turns out that people who have egalitarian beliefs, I would say I believe I have egalitarian beliefs, but I still have implicit biases against other groups. The only thing is I can control them. I do a good job. I take some of my mind every day, and when I meet students from different ethnicities, I use cognitive power, my cognitive resources, to push down those biases so they don't affect my behavior. But these two people named Grinfield, Banaji, and Greenwald actually found that when you take people like myself who say who test as being egalitarian, when you ask us to make judgments, biased judgments under cognitive load, like while we're doing math tests, the biases that I am able to push down actually pop to the surface. Does that make sense? So what they're suggesting is that all of us, in a sense, have these deep down automatic processes. But the difference between your typical obnoxious racist and the person who is egalitarian is that us egalitarian people, both of any race, take cognitive effort to push down those automatic biases that we have. Now, if you don't believe this, what I'd like for you to do is, I put this also in your course resources link. There's an implicit bias test which can help you uncover the implicit biases you may have against males or females or religious people or homosexual people or African Americans or Asians. So if you go to implicit.harvard.edu, they have these tests where they have you make quick judgments as fast as you can, and they can show negative or positive evaluations that you have about these groups. And I guarantee you will be shocked and surprised to find out the biases that you have hiding deep down in your brain. Okay? Okay, final thing I want to talk about is how groups affect our behavior. The weird thing is that having people around while we engage in behavior, that people's influence does affect how we choose to behave. We're going to talk about this in more detail tomorrow, but I want to talk to you about how the presence of people impacts our behavior. One of the oldest findings in psychology, actually it comes back from 1898, even before the birth of social psychology, is this idea of social facilitation. When people are doing something that they're good at, they do it much faster and much better in the presence of others. All right. So, for example, take a professional basketball player. They're probably actually going to hit more shots in front of a crowd of people than they will in the gym by themselves. If you see people who are engaging in a foot race, they're actually going to run faster in front of a crowd of people than they will in front of an empty stadium. And so I wonder how those professional athletes are going to perform since they're not playing in front of crowds. This term is called social facilitation. Now, when you put people in a group and ask them to do something collectively, what you'll find is the exact opposite. Social loafing occurs. In collaborative tasks, the presence of others decreases our performance. So in the old classic experience, they would put people in sound booths and they would let them see 4 other people sitting in sound booths, and they would tell them to scream as loud as they could. And it turns out that when there weren't people in the other sound booths, people yelled louder than when there were other people in the sound booth. Same thing with tug of war. If they ask people to tug on a rope and measure the pounds per square foot pressure that they put on it alone, and compare that with the pounds per square foot that they put on it when there's a group of them pulling, what you'll find is that people actually in collective tasks, the presence of other decreases the effectiveness of our functioning. Now, a fellow named Phil Zimbardo did this crazy study in the 70s to find out what would happen if you put people into roles. So he went to this college campus, Stanford. Actually, he was a professor there, and he recruited 20 college students to perform an experiment. And what he did was he randomly assigned half of them to be prisoners and half of them to be cops. And what he did was he recruited the local police to go and, quote, arrest the prisoners on a Saturday morning and brought them to a jail he had created down in the basement of the Stanford lab. Now, he gave his cops, the prison wardens, he gave them gray uniforms and mirrored sunglasses, and he wanted to see what would happen. Would these people who had randomly been selected to these roles, would they adopt the roles that they were given? And what he found is that these people, actually, the individual guards, lost their sense of individual morality and started acting really horrible and dehumanizing towards the prisoners. And he actually had to disband the study after a week because the prisoners started developing anxiety-related problems. And what he found was that these guards were really ruthless and abusive towards these prisoners, beginning almost the second day into the study. It's almost as if they forgot their individual morals and lost their individuation. And he argued that de-individuation, sometimes in these group settings, people lose their individual sense of morality and do really horrible things. Now, I remember thinking this was the stupidest study I'd ever seen, and there was no way it could really happen until during the first Gulf War, or the second Gulf War, we set up a prison camp. America set up a prison camp in Iraq called Abu Ghraib, and pictures and videos came out of that, of these soldiers humiliating and teasing and abusing Iraqi soldiers. And the crazy thing is, the behaviors they were engaging in looked eerily similar to the ones that Phil Zimbardo's guards were doing. It was shocking to me when this happened. And so these represent times, if you put people in groups, sometimes they lose their sense of individual morality. That's exactly what happened in Nazi Germany. And in fact, we're going to revisit this tomorrow, KB, and I'm going to suggest to you that it is quite possible, if put in the right situation, you would be willing to kill too on the advice of what you thought was a legitimate authority. Now, one of the things that I see, the last thing I'm going to talk about, one of the things you'll see on social media is a group of people pumping each other up about an idea that they all generally believe in. And as you watch the comments go, what you'll notice is the comments will get even more and more and more extreme until those people's attitudes and statements are way more extreme than they originally started out as. And this is typically known as group polarization. And they've done these experiments where they put people into groups where they're either very liberal on an idea or conservative on an idea. And as long as there is an established group norm and everybody feels generally the same way, what they find is people's attitudes towards the topic gets more extreme after they discuss the topic. So if you're a Trump fan and I measure how much you like Trump and then put you in a group of Trump supporters and you talk for a half an hour, you'll like Trump even more than you did at the beginning of the discussion. If you're a Trump hater and I put you in a group of people who don't like Trump and I measure your attitude at the beginning of the talk, after a half an hour, your attitude towards Trump will become even more negative. And so what happens sometimes is that getting ourselves in group causes us to become even more extreme in our opinions than we tend to start out as. Right? Now, so here's the point with social psychology. Social psychology explains how groups affect the way we think, feel, and behave. Now, when we try to make judgments about why people and ourselves do things, we're trying to give control to our world. So we have dispositional and situational attributions, and we use those so that our world is predictable and our behavior is flexible. But we do have several basic biases that we need to be aware of when we make attributions about other people's behaviors. So next time that server is rude to you, give them a break. They might be having a bad day. Now, keep in mind that groups, being in a group, whatever group it is you're in, male, female, white, black, orange, yellow, green, whatever, remember that there are certain natural inborn biases that you have in your system that are going to affect how you behave. And you need to be aware of these. They happen. They're not bad nor good. They're just part of how our individual identity works, because part of who you are as an individual is determined by the groups that you are in. And then I want you to realize that group identity really affects the way our attitudes are changed and where our behavior is changed in engaging in tasks and discussing topics. Does anybody have any questions? I am sorry I set the latency on really high, so it's probably going to be a couple of minutes before any of you even hear what I'm saying. But when you do, please feel free to text your questions and I will answer them. Okay, that's all I had to say today. I hope to see you tomorrow in class where I'll have my camera fixed and we can talk again. So take care.